great privilege and it is indeed a gift that we owe to the magnificent institution of the Shulman Lectures, made possible by the generosity of Richard and Barbara Franke. And I can present to you tonight Peter Deere, Professor of History and History of Science at Cornell University. And I'm very happy to say that Professor Bob Shulman, in whose honor this lecture is named, and his wife, Professor Spangler, are here with us tonight too. Peter Deere's work is a natural point of reference for someone like me, who is a liberal critic and historian who happens to be also interested in the history of knowledge, for someone who has come to this interest through studies in Oriental rhetoric and its intertwinement with other modes of speaking and arguing, philosophy and science, and the epochal changes which took place in particular in the 17th century. Peter Deere's books give not only answers to so many questions someone like me might ask, more than that, they formulate the very questions, and among them the question of evidence, through which we come only to grasp what can be addressed in this broad interdisciplinary field. As the philosopher Hans Blumenberg might have said, we learn through Peter Deere's work what it has been we had wanted to know before we got to know what we do know. Let me mention only two words or concepts which play an important role in Peter Deere's writings. The first of them pinpoints what we discussed this afternoon in the seminar, and the second I assume might have some bearing of what we're going to hear about tonight. The one word and concept is experience, or I should say the pair of experience and expertise. This is the center of studies which circle around the scientific revolution of the 17th century, in particular in discipline and experience, Peter Deere's book from 1995 and some other books. Experiences in early modern language, as Peter Deere makes clear, is first of all what it meant in Aristotle's teachings, having a sense of what happens in our common world almost, always, or almost most of the time, and what thereby backs but does not generate our knowledge of causes and permanent entities of being. This experience is what we share as rational beings. Expertise, in contradistinction, is related to individual skills and ways how to access things in nature. Expertise has to do with perception, events, and theoretical modeling. Expertise is creating and is based on authority. In order for scientific revolution to become possible, experience must be rearticulated in terms of expertise. The other word I have in mind as a key word in Peter Deere's writings is intelligibility. It appears front and center in the title of his book, The Intelligibility of Nature, How Science Makes Sense of the World, from 2006. In the book, Peter Deere traverses great historical distances from Galileo to Newton, and Newton to Einstein and Niels Bohr, with Darwin, it seems to me, as a central figure in the middle. The intelligibility of nature refers to an open series of devices of research and representation, of preparing things for investigation and theoretical modeling. These are all facets of the philosophy of nature, a philosophy of nature, however, that is rather resultant from these practices and modeling devices than underlying them. This philosophy of science that results from the ways in which science is formulated, carried through, and communicated, as Peter Deere shows, is the epitome of how science makes sense of the world, or, as he puts it in the conclusion of this book, how science makes our knowledge of nature natural. Instead of enumerating further books, volumes, and chapters, most of you know certainly Revolutionizing the Sciences, European Knowledge and Ambitions, 1500 to 1700, I would like to turn the podium over to Peter Deere. Again, I would like to thank you, Peter, for being here tonight that I would like again to thank Professor Shulman and his wife to be with us. Thank
you. Okay, thank you. It will be difficult for me to represent what I'm going to talk about today as concerning the early modern or even the long early modern, a category that I just thought of. It's difficult to extend it as far forward as Darwin, so I'll just get on with it and let it, so to speak for itself. Now, the great evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr famously claimed that the practices of classification in natural history underwent no sharp change following the rapid acceptance among naturalists in the 1860s of Darwin's transformism. More recently, Polly Windsor has argued for the importance of taxonomy in the development of Darwin's great theory, at the same time rejecting the common association of pre-Darwinian classification with some kind of opposed essentialism. In effect, her argument similarly blends taxonomy before and after 1859. Broadly speaking, these sorts of positions, I think, are surely correct. Darwin especially used arguments referring to varieties, species, and genera throughout his writings, and he could hardly have expected his use of those categories to carry any persuasive force if he'd had to reinvent them wholesale. It's centrally important, though, to distinguish, I think, between, on the one hand, taxonomic ideas that were concerned with interpretation of the meaning of taxonomic groupings and relationships. I mean ideas such as branching models, archetypes, genealogy itself. And on the other hand, taxonomic practices involving the choice of particular characters as classificatory criteria. And I'm particularly concerned with this second question. Now, Darwin clearly recognized his reliance on the work of other non-transformist taxonomists, and he needed in effect to explain how their work could have produced just such groupings as his own theory explained through descent with modification. Since these groupings served in many cases as evidence for his theory, they could scarcely be accepted on its basis. Darwin wanted only to reinterpret their meaning, not to undermine the notion of an already achieved natural classification. He wanted to use accepted taxa as data for his theory, when only his theory, he thought, could justify them. So the question is, how could that be without argumentative circularity? Clearly some other means of acknowledging the legitimacy of the naturalist groupings was needed. And so it appears in a well-known passage towards the end of The Origin of Species. Darwin says, "The characters which naturalists consider as showing true affinity between any two or more species are those which have been inherited from a common parent. And insofar, all true classification is genealogical. The community of descent is the hidden bond which naturalists have been unconsciously seeking." So, like Arthur Koestler's Sleepwalkers, Darwin's fellow naturalists, those unenlightened by the doctrine of descent with modification, were on the right track without knowing it. And they'd often used correct procedures in going about their work of classification without knowing what justified those procedures. And Darwin can now tell them what they've been doing all along, speaking the prose of transformism. And I should stress at this point that, of course, I'm not myself allying myself with Koestler's notion of sleepwalking scientists stumbling towards the truth. Now, that Darwin had faith in the practices of conventional taxonomy appears throughout his work. In Chapter 2 of The Origin, he'd drawn attention to the difficulties that were attendant on discriminating between distinct species and mere varieties. Rather than denying the reality of that distinction, though, he explains how it should be managed in practice. So this is Darwin again. Hence, in determining whether a form should be ranked as a species or a variety, the opinion of naturalists having sound judgment and wide experience seems the only guide to follow. We must, however, in many cases, decide by a majority of naturalists, for few well-marked and well-known varieties can be named which have not been ranked as species by at least some competent judges. Now note that there's no question here of not deciding the question. Distinguishing between varieties and species is what naturalists do, and Darwin had no interest in rocking the boat. This isn't to say that Darwin trusted the community of naturalists always to get things right. This was particularly problematic in the discrimination between varieties and species. The criteria used were generally morphological and not dependent on evidence of membership in a common reproductive community. Darwin knew that that wasn't any clear-cut criterion anyway. Naturalists, Darwin assumed, reproduced the natural order in their responses to it. He illustrated the problem by imagining a beginner in the process of joining the coterie of naturalists, having the requisite sound judgment and wide experience. That's the pre-existing expert naturalists. So he says, when a young naturalist commences the study of a group of organisms quite unknown to him, he is at first much perplexed to determine what differences to consider as specific and what as varieties, for he knows nothing of the amount and kind of variation to which the group is subject, and this shows at least how very generally there is some variation. So the ubiquity of variation is affirmed not by its existence in nature, but by the inexperienced naturalist's supposed perplexity. And then Darwin goes on. But if he confine his attention to one class within one country, he will soon make up his mind how to rank most of the doubtful forms. His general tendency will be to make many species, for he will become impressed, just like the pigeon or poultry fancier, with the amount of difference in the forms which he is continually studying. And he has little general knowledge of analogical variation in other groups and in other countries by which to correct his first impressions. Now, the culmination of this type of the young naturalist acquiring taxonomic competence, once he extends his knowledge appropriately, is that he will, in the end, generally be enabled to make up his own mind which to call varieties and which species, but he will succeed in this at the expense of admitting much variation. He will have become, in other words, one of those who have sound judgment and wide experience. Now, Darwin's deference to expert judgment in these sorts of cases rested, of course, on his conviction, well before he wrote The Origin, that varieties, species, genera, as well as all the higher taxonomic groupings, bore similar relations to one another, genera being to species as species were to varieties or subspecies, and with no essential distinction between them. He says, I look at the term species as one arbitrarily given for the sake of convenience to a set of individuals closely resembling each other, and that it does not essentially differ from the term variety. Nonetheless, the judgment of expert naturalists on these sorts of questions weren't therefore meaningless for Darwin. They contained truths revealing of the natural world itself. This was despite the inevitable disagreements between those experts. Darwin's assertion that the budding naturalist will eventually be able to judge what to call varieties and what species only by, as he said, admitting much variation, is wryly qualified with the remark that the truth of this admission will often be disputed by other naturalists. Now, Darwin's use of the classificatory conclusions of his fellow naturalists typically took the form of using those conclusions as surrogate phenomena. It should be borne in mind, of course, that determinations of the reality of taxonomic groupings differed from descriptive accounts of particular organisms. Darwin very frequently cited descriptions of organisms' behaviors or attributes based on accounts provided to him by correspondents or in published authorities. But the judgments of those people, of the kind employed in reckoning some form a distinct species or a new variety of a known species, were something else again. Darwin turned such judgments to account in a variety of ways. One is displayed shortly after the foregoing discussion from Chapter 2 of The Origin. From looking at species as only strongly marked and well-defined varieties, I was led to anticipate that the species of the larger genera in each country would oftener present varieties than the species of the smaller genera. And his evidentiary material for testing this anticipation was the systematic work of other naturalists, as he'd already explained. He says, I thought that some interesting results might be obtained in regard to the nature and relations of the species which vary most by tabulating all the varieties in several well-worked floras. Now, despite acknowledging the difficulties which have been urged on him, especially by Joseph Hooker, that would have to attend this sort of procedure, Darwin went ahead with his comparisons anyway. Expert authority again underpinned his arguments, which were prefaced by the imprimatur of Hooker himself, who, Darwin says, thinks that the following statements are fairly well established. Now, the Origin doesn't itself contain any of the tables that Darwin drew up to record the relevant numbers. Some appear in the manuscript text of his Big Species book that the Origin supplanted. The data of the guileless naturalist, gathered without any theoretical axes to grind, served Darwin as an apparently neutral test of his suppositions. This is despite the fact that Darwin recognizes no sharp discrimination between varieties and species, allows considerable variation among individuals, and is therefore accordingly unsurprised by disagreement among naturalists on particular instances. His numbers, in other words, seem to refer to entities conjured up by the naturalist, yet for these purposes Darwin treats them as if they were mere descriptions of nature. Judgments of significant similarities and differences cannot by their nature be descriptive, of course. They are fundamentally evaluative. But evaluative of what? Now, Darwin's remark in The Origin to the effect that the characters which naturalists consider as showing true affinity between any two or more species are those which have been inherited from a common parent, that gives no clue as to what those naturalists themselves thought they were doing. It merely tells us what Darwin believed they were really doing. Naturalists' own reasons for their choices of classificatory criteria were, from that perspective, strictly irrelevant, because those reasons were not correctly based on notions of common descent. Instead, the only point of interest for Darwin was the final classificatory arrangement concluded by the naturalist. The fundamental grounds on which it was explicitly justified couldn't be held relevant to its assessment. The skilled naturalist's decisions were, for Darwin, data to be used as evidence. They couldn't, by their very nature, be reasons or arguments. Now, when Darwin referred to systematic classification of organisms, he necessarily invoked a considerable history of taxonomic theory and practice. The theory made sense of what Darwin often described as affinities in nature. But the determination of true affinities needed for his project to be accomplished independently of a specification of what those affinities really meant. The holy grail of the naturalist classifier had long been, and in the 18th century had become codified as, the natural system. Now, that kind of taxonomic system would transcend the merely conventional, as Darwin puts it, like the grouping of the stars in constellations, and it would transcend the conventional by representing the true affinities of the different beings found in nature. The result would be the long-sought natural system. Carl Linnaeus had spent his life in search of this system, all the while doubting that he'd succeeded in approaching it. Linnaeus' own elaborate published systems, with their selections of characters designed to assist the naturalist in pigeonholing new species, he himself characterized as artificial. By the turn of the century, you have various naturalists, most notably Antoine Laurent de Jussieu and Georges Cuvier, making claims to the invention of a set of criteria that would yield a justifiably natural classification in both botany and zoology. The asserted naturalness in each case derived from functional associations of the selected classificatory characters, which provided arguments for an appropriate subordination of function to function, and thereby character to character, in a hierarchy that could be mapped onto the hierarchy of taxonomic categories that typified Linnaeus's widely used or imitated practical systems. The proposition that taxonomic practice yielded a natural system of classification was therefore largely accepted in the first half of the 19th century, even though the theoretical arguments for its validity were sometimes rather sketchy. Darwin, in effect, accepted it too, but his grounds for doing so took on a paradoxical cast, as he became committed to descent with modification as the true cause of the affinities proclaimed by the classification developed by other naturalists. By the time of the Origin, the especially influential work of Cuvier, with its subordination of characters rule to guide functional zoological taxonomy, had lost theoretical and practical ground to purely morphological aspects of comparative anatomy. Yet the non-conventional natural image of classification still had survived. Darwin therefore represented the underlying sentiment supporting the standard view of the natural system of classification as an idealistic conception of the kind that predated the functional approaches of the late 18th century. This is what he says. Some authors look at the natural system merely as a scheme for arranging together those living objects which are most alike, and for separating those which are most unlike, or as an artificial means for enunciating as briefly as possible general propositions. But many naturalists think that something more is meant by the natural system. They believe that it reveals the plan of the Creator. But unless it be specified whether order in time or space or what else is meant by the plan of the Creator, it seems to me that nothing is thus added to our knowledge. So Darwin fully accepted the naturalness of the natural system, but not in the same way as that in which most other naturalists did, whether based on function, the adequacy of which Darwin promptly impugns, or in divinity. Now, in order to establish the meaning and ontological foundation of the natural system's supposed naturalness, Darwin has first, therefore, to accept that naturalness as a given, and only then to infer its true sense. Classification was supposed to reveal affinities between organisms, but like the plan of the Creator, unspecified kinds of affinity might seem to add little to our knowledge. Here's Darwin again. Such expressions as that famous one of Linnaeus, and which we often meet with in a more or less concealed form, that the characters do not make the genus, but that the genus gives the characters, seem to imply that something more is included in our classification than mere resemblance. Now that almost Wittgensteinian view places the taxonomic cart before the classificatory horse. Conviction of the existence of the genus precedes knowledge of the characters that serve to identify it, just as the entire taxonomic system precedes, for Darwin, the classificatory criteria that justify it. His genealogical explanation of existing natural taxonomies makes sense, Darwin reckoned, of the very classificatory procedures that produce them. So he says, on this idea of the natural system being, insofar as it's been perfected, genealogical in its arrangement, we can understand the rules which we are compelled to follow in our classification. We can understand why we value certain resemblances far more than others, why we are permitted to use rudimentary and useless organs or others of trifling physiological importance. Now, a crucial feature of this assertion is that it represents classificatory procedures as ones carried out not according to merely general rules, but to rules that we are, as Darwin says, compelled to follow. Darwin asserts this idea that the naturalist is willy-nilly compelled to proceed in particular ways without explaining the nature of the compulsion. The only evidence for its existence is the supposition that naturalists do in fact follow such procedures, and that naturalists are not, for the most part, capricious in doing so. As Darwin puts it elsewhere in The Origin, descent was the hidden bond of connection which naturalists have been seeking under the term of the natural system, evidently all unbeknownst to themselves. Darwin offers only a strictly irrelevant ontological argument for the origin of the accepted classificatory compulsions, explaining that his genealogical account of their suitability enables us, as he says, to understand them. But that argument still fails to explain why naturalists who do not recognize that what they're doing is in fact reconstructing genealogies, nonetheless in fact do so. As a counterpoint, Darwin sets up as the only alternative account of the natural system this rather antiquated view of it as revealing the plan of the creator, which he seems to treat as a rather weak straw man position. The mystery of how, without the naturalist having prior knowledge of it, the creator's plan could serve to direct the naturalist's classificatory compulsions is in fact no more obscure than the mystery of how a conjectured genealogical origin of classificatory knowledge could reveal itself through the naturalist's sleepwalking practices. The natural system, accepted in advance, begs the question of its own discovery. Perhaps, though, the compulsions didn't flow from the classificatory rules themselves, let alone, going behind the rules, from their justifying ontology, whether it's the natural system as God's plan or as the outcome of descent with modification. Perhaps Darwin meant instead the sort of primitive behaviors that made human beings favor ornamentation of the body, or peahens admire the gaudy plumage of peacocks. Taxonomy, in other words, perhaps worked rather like sexual selection, discussed at such great length in Darwin's Descent of Man in 1871. Why females of some species preferred particular supposedly beautiful features in the males, Darwin never really explained, except by reference to some shared aesthetic sensibility. It's hard not to suspect a vicious circularity in his arguments, insofar as in those sorts of cases, Darwin can suggest no functional advantage for those preferences. In a similar way, the naturalist's compulsion in his selections of classificatory criteria were also primitive and inexplicable, yet somehow resulted, through some great pre-established harmony, in a taxonomic system that corresponded to the true natural system of descent with modification. Now, in practice, this is certainly how Darwin tended to establish the legitimacy of taxonomic judgments. He routinely cited what one might expect naturalists to do in some case of classificatory determination, although there's a subtle differentiation between his generic invocations of classificatory practice and those of named and presumably especially competent naturalists. As to the former cases, the generic cases, generic naturalists may often be deceived, according to Darwin. Thus Darwin on show pigeons. He says, altogether at least a score of pigeons might be chosen, which if shown to an ornithologist and he were told that they were wild birds, would certainly, I think, be ranked by him as well-defined species. Or this other quote on the issue of what we now call convergent evolution. He says, a naturalist struck by a parallelism of this nature in any one class, by arbitrarily raising or sinking the value of the groups in other classes, and all our experience shows that this valuation has hitherto been arbitrary, could easily extend the parallelism over a wide range, and thus the septenary, quinary, quaternary, and ternary classifications have probably arisen. And then, by contrast, we have approving citations of apparently dispositive judgments, as with this reference to the Oxford ornithologist John Gould. Mr. Gould remarked to me long ago that in those genera of birds which range over the world, many of the species have very wide ranges. I can hardly doubt that this rule is generally true, though it will be difficult to prove it. Now, Darwin's acceptance of Gould's generalization seems to rest largely on a reliance on Gould's abilities to see the realities behind formal criteria, because otherwise, as Darwin says, it will be difficult to prove it. Gould was, of course, the ornithologist who persuaded Darwin that the finches he'd collected in the Galapagos should be classed as distinct species and not, as Darwin had previously supposed, merely different varieties. Darwin's earlier acceptance of that judgment is really rather worth noting, because it indicates not only that Darwin in this case became increasingly aware of the fine line between varieties and species, as he reported, but also that the taxonomic judgment itself retained some significance for him. He could have decided that Gould's determination clouded the distinctness of these categories and then merely have taken them less seriously in the future. But he chose instead to retain the socially entrenched taxonomic category of species and to use the delicacy of judgment that it involved as evidence of the way that distinct species can be seen as emerging gradually from previous merely varietal distinctions. Now, another instance of the tacit knowledge or wisdom that Darwin takes to lie behind the best classificatory practices appears in the Origins chapter devoted to classification. This is what he notes there at one point. When Aspicarpa produced in France during several years only degraded flowers, departing so wonderfully in a number of the most important points of structure from the proper type of the order, yet Monsieur Richard sagaciously saw, as Jussieu observes, that this genus should still be retained amongst the Malpighiaceae. This case seems to me well to illustrate the spirit with which our classifications are sometimes necessarily founded. So, l'esprit systématique here comes to the aid of the botanist who might otherwise be misled by his materials. Now, this privileging of the favoured expert naturalist over his workaday nameless colleagues is by no means uniform in the way Darwin talks about these matters. The chapter on classification in the Origin also cites as further support the tendency of taxonomists to disregard the physiological importance of the characters that they privilege when making classificatory assignments. So he says, practically, when naturalists are at work, they do not trouble themselves about the physiological value of the characters which they use in defining a group or in allocating any particular species. If they find a character nearly uniform and common to a great number of forms and not common to others, they use it as one of high value. If common to some lesser number, they use it as of subordinate value. Now, support for the rightness of this taxonomic behaviour is then found by Darwin in the judgments of the most august authorities. He says, this principle has been broadly confessed by some naturalists to be the true one, and by none more clearly than by that excellent botanist Auguste Saint-Hilaire. If certain characters are always found correlated with others, though no apparent bond of connection can be discovered between them, a special value is set on them. So according to Darwin, this is what even the best of naturalists generally do, and Darwin clearly affords it considerable evidential value as to how it ought to be done. One final example, evidently referring here without naming him to the great zoologist Richard Owen, among others, Darwin writes towards the end of the Origin, naturalists frequently speak of the skull as formed of metamorphosed vertebrae, the jaws of crabs as metamorphosed legs, the stamens and pistils of flowers as metamorphosed leaves. Naturalists, however, use such language only in a metaphorical sense. On my view, these terms may be used literally. So yet again, naturalists were on the right track, but had no suspicion of that track's true import. Now, Darwin's overt classificatory practice wasn't restricted to his drawing on the judgments of other naturalists only when making broad comparative arguments. His own detailed work on classification shows similar and necessary reliance on the sensibilities, one might almost say moral authority, of other naturalists. His principal taxonomic endeavour, the great work on the class Cirripedia, published in the early 1850s, in the case of living barnacles, contains much detailed anatomical description, for which Darwin actually apologizes. He says, although the present volume is strictly systematic, I will, under the general description of the Lepididae, difficult to pronounce that, Lepididae, give a very brief abstract of some of the most interesting points in their internal anatomy and in the metamorphoses of the whole class, which I hope hereafter to treat with the necessary illustrations in detail. Darwin was particularly interested in all this work, as he told his friend Hooker, in the light that curious variations in sexual dimorphism and hermaphroditism threw on the evolutionary origins of sex. But of course, those kinds of arguments couldn't ever appear explicitly in this pre-origin, apparently technical, systematic work. The more straightforwardly classificatory work appears more clearly in Darwin's companion volumes on fossil cirripedes, where internal anatomy wasn't a consideration. Nonetheless, the earlier work on living barnacles was essential to the work, especially given the limited number of specimens and the usual large variability of many features that were exhibited by individual species of barnacle. Darwin, as before, was of course especially concerned with naming, and he adhered scrupulously to the instituted standards proclaimed by the British Association in 1842, which had made the 1758 10th edition of Linnaeus's Systema Naturae the starting point for naming practices and the precedents for priorities in naming. And I might mention that Darwin was himself a member of the relevant committee of the British Association. Darwin was careful throughout this work to locate himself inside this ongoing communal enterprise, and he simply found it unnecessary to use evolutionary arguments to justify his focus on, for example, homologies as being of particular classificatory significance. Because after all, there were always other naturalists to be cited who had behaved similarly, even if their justifications weren't transferable to his work. In practice, classification was always very much a communal endeavour, and the work of other naturalists was as much of a foundation as were morphological characters themselves. In all these examples, the alleged behaviour of naturalists is used to reveal something about nature itself, whether they realised it or not. In classifying plants and animals, naturalists were mapping out genealogical relationships among organisms, relationships that could only properly be understood with the assistance of Darwin's theory. So why does Darwin trust them? How does he think that they're capable of doing this? The question, I think, requires a bit of consideration of Darwin's implicit anthropology, that's to say, of his understanding of human beings and their relationship to the natural world as a whole. Darwin always resisted the elevation of man to a state qualitatively superior to the rest of nature. His treatment of human origins had from the start been thoroughly naturalistic, with the most characteristic human traits, namely those of intellect and aesthetic judgment, for Darwin, being routinely compared as matters of degree with their supposed equivalents in other animals. One of his means of doing this involved discussing the anatomy of the brain. Taking the brain as the organ of the mind, Darwin liked to emphasize the basic comparability of the human brain and those of other primates. In The Descent of Man, of course, he confronts his old adversary Richard Owen on precisely this point. He notes that Owen, quote, relying chiefly on the structure of the brain, divided mammals into 4 subclasses, one of which contained man alone. Now, Darwin's technique for dismissing the plausibility of Owen's classification was quite simple. He says, "This view has not been accepted, as far as I am aware, by any naturalist capable of forming an independent judgment, and therefore need not here be further considered." Now, the lack of substantive argument isn't simply a matter of scorn for Owen. It reflects the nature of classification itself. The enumeration of specific criteria would only provide grounds for controversy, so that nothing but the judgment of competent naturalists could ever settle that kind of question definitively. Darwin's use of the community's taxonomic judgments comes into play especially in his discussion of human races. The theme, which is discussed at length in Descent of Man, relies heavily once again on taxonomic arguments that are rooted in the classificatory behavior, actual or presumed, of contemporary naturalists. After a lot of consideration about what a representative naturalist might be expected to do about the question, Darwin concludes that taking into account the various standard sorts of arguments for separating the races of man into separate species, or else linking them together as one great species with perhaps various geographically distinct varieties, he cuts the Gordian knot by in effect dismissing the whole question as insoluble, insofar as the term species itself is essentially vague. He says, if we reflect on the weighty arguments for raising the races of man to the dignity of species and the insuperable difficulties on the other side in defining them, the term subspecies might here be used with much propriety. but then he admits habit will probably leave the term race as the one that people will continue to use, and so does Darwin himself in his subsequent discussions in Descent of Man. What's of most concern to Darwin is to argue for a monogenetic origin for all humanity, as against the polygenist theory of multiple origins for distinct races. How issues of divergence among different lines of human descent might be handled taxonomically is then of less moment to him. James Moore and Adrian Desmond have quite recently argued that the involvement of Darwin and his family, including his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, in the abolitionist cause gave Darwin's position particular salience. But there can be no doubt of the wholly naturalistic way in which Darwin subsumes the classification of human beings to precisely the same procedures and taxonomic issues as applied to the rest of the organic world. The analogy is total. The similarities between the classification of animals and that of human beings still involve centrally for Darwin the use of the naturalist or most naturalists as the crucial credential for taxonomic judgment. So, for example, he matches the ambiguities attending the classification of South American cebus monkeys with similar approaches to human types. He says, if numerous specimens of cebus were collected from all parts of South America, and those forms which at present appear to be specifically distinct were found to graduate into each other by close steps, they would be ranked by most naturalists as mere varieties or races, and thus the greater number of naturalists have acted with respect to the races of man. Hence the fundamental ambiguities surrounding the issue, which were all applicable, in Darwin's view, to the case of humanity. If, on the other hand, the races of man were the result of convergent evolution from two quite distinct forebears, as in an analogous case of certain pigs, Darwin says, it can hardly be doubted that marked differences in the structure of certain bones would still have been discoverable in man as he now exists. Now, what's of particular importance to Darwin is that no characteristic feature of modern man should set him apart from other animals, that nothing qualitatively unique be found in man and man alone. So he makes a special point of making the case that what he calls human intellectual powers are themselves nothing but the highest level of a continuous distribution. He says, the development of these powers in animals does not offer any special difficulty. For with our domesticated animals, the mental faculties are certainly variable, and the variations are inherited. Therefore, the conditions are favorable for their development through natural selection. Or, as he puts it more colorfully elsewhere, he says, the mental faculties of man and the lower animals do not differ in kind, although immensely in degree. A difference in degree, however great, does not justify us in placing man in a distinct kingdom, as will perhaps be best illustrated by comparing the mental powers of two insects, namely a coccus or scale insect and an ant, which undoubtedly belong to the same class. And he then gives an account of the remarkable behaviors of ants as contrasted with the dull and inactive coccus. The so-called moral sense receives a similar general treatment. He says, the first foundation or origin of the moral sense lies in the social instincts, including sympathy. And these instincts, no doubt, were primarily gained, as in the case of the lower animals, through natural selection. Now, the image here of nature knowing itself is inescapable, it seems to me, but in a rather direct way, and one that goes beyond attributing special powers to human beings themselves, simply taken as part of nature. Darwin wanted mental abilities to be seen as a part of nature, produced through natural selection, like most things in the organic world, and only differences in degree, not differences in kind, were involved. It followed from this that human taxonomic abilities, which sleepwalker naturalists display, were not themselves unique in the animal kingdom. And so Darwin effectively acknowledged when, in 1863, he addressed the entomologist Henry Bates' work on protective mimicry in Amazonian butterflies. One species of butterfly, toothsome to predatory birds, had markings very similar to another much more populous species that was noxious to those same birds. The historian Staffan Müller-Wille has noted Darwin's remark in his review of Bates' first paper on this subject that the similarity was so great that Mr. Bates, says Darwin, with his eyes sharpened by collecting during 11 years, was, though always on my guard, thus Bates, continually deceived. Bates, in other words, on Darwin's view, clearly possessed taxonomic intuitions, much like those of Amazonian birds, even when they were misled. Now, this commonality of human classificatory compulsions and those of animals shows why Darwin was so comfortable with seconding the aesthetic preferences of peahens. Anthropomorphism of this kind was neither naive nor capricious. Instead, certain things were simply what animals, including humans, found beautiful. But how could that kind of unity justify taxonomic judgments of similarity or difference? How could it give force to the compulsions of the naturalist? Darwin, in effect, naturalized the so-called natural system. In the end, whatever naturalists tended to do was, in the main, determined by the mysterious compulsions trained by natural selection. But in practice, this meant that Darwin was happy to rest some confidence in the general classificatory tendencies expressed by people who were, in fact, appropriately socialized members of the European natural history community. The natural system might not have reflected God's plan in Darwin's view, but it did reflect, in a Durkheimian sort of way perhaps, the judgments of his own scientific colleagues. Those colleagues were Darwin's mirror of nature. Okay, thank you.